A short flight from Las Vegas, deep in the Nevada desert, lies Area 51, the CIA's secret. A giant clandestine base that remained unacknowledged and disavowed by the U.S. government for almost 60 years.
It's the most secret military base on the planet. But no one's ever been this close until now. What is the government hiding inside? Is it secret weapons or extraterrestrial technology?
We're taking it apart to figure out how it works.
And what happens when people venture too far? Now, declassified information, inside accounts, revelations from former CIA pilots.
I saw a flying saucer.
But in August of 2013, the CIA finally admits this place is real.
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came,
And for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order. New world order.
we saw,
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the law.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
he died. He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
You can keep it. Period. 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 They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm St. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 011, the John Lear Files. The castle feels sufficiently tidy this evening, so we're going to get right to John Lear. John is the son of William P. Lear, designer of the Learjet executive aircraft, the 8-track stereo, and the founder of Lear, Inc. He wrote extensively about airplanes and other subjects as a correspondent for Combat Illustrated between 1975 and 1977. Mr. Lear retired in 2001, having flown over 150 different types of aircraft, and as an airplane pilot, having flown over 19,500 hours in 60 different countries for 25 different airlines. At the age of 28, he was one of the youngest Boeing 707 captains to fly an airline commercial service. In a flirtation with politics, John then was a candidate for the office in the state of Nevada. To the concern of the Pentagon, John's dad was outspoken in his belief of the existence of extraterrestrial visitors. However, John did not become interested in the subject until 1985, when UFO stories captured his attention. John played a major part in the Bob Lazar story over 1988 and 1989, a topic which we will discuss in detail with him this evening. John received widespread national attention through his appearances on Coast to Coast AM with both Art Bell and George Norrie. He's been a highly sought-after speaker and a guest on television and radio since. John believes that humans were on the moon by 1962 and Mars by 1967, and that the NASA Apollo program was a hoax and never put a man on the moon. John has a wide array of views about what is really going on the moon and beyond. So tonight, Midnight Rider News is proud to bring you John Lear. John, how are you this evening?
Hey, good. How are you?
I'm well, and I'm excited to have you on. So let's start at the beginning for you. What was the origin of your interest in what's now called the paranormal?
I think you'd have to go back to 1985. I had been interested in saucers and entry and weird stuff. And there's a letter floating around the internet, which is really interesting. I wrote it in 1980 to John Andrews, who was vice president of testers and made the models of the F-117A and then the model of the saucer that Bob worked on. And when I started talking with John Andrews, he mentioned flying saucers, and what did I think about it? And I said, I've looked into it, there's nothing to it, forget it. That was in 1980. Then in 1985, I was host for the reunion of pilots that flew in Southeast Asia for different companies, CIA, Continental, Air America, and Air Force and Army. And we'd meet in Las Vegas every 2 years. And one of my friends was a guy named Greg Wilson who flew A-10s. And started talking with him, and I said, where all you been for the last couple of years? And he said, well, you know, I was stationed at Bentwaters. And I said, Bentwaters? That's supposedly where the flying saucer landed in 1980, Christmas 1980. And he said, not supposedly, John, it did. Now, I didn't get to see it because I was confined to quarters, but I know the guys who did, and yes, it did happen. And I said, so this stuff is real? He said, absolutely. So that's what kicked it off then. And shortly after that, Bill Moore came out with the Eisenhower briefing, and the big question was, is MJ-12 real? Because this is the first any of us had ever heard of it, and there was no substantiation for it. Nobody knew anything about it, and it seemed like if I could prove that, or if I could find a yes or no, real or not real, to MJ-12, that would be the major start for studying UFOs or trying to find out more about them. So one of the persons that I knew had to be involved with the UFOs was General Jimmy Doolittle. Now, of course, we know he took off from a carrier to bomb Tokyo, crash-landed in China, and he was a friend of our family. I lived in Santa Monica, 222 14th Street, and he lived down on 3rd Street with his wife, Jo, and they were always around the house, you know, for different parties and stuff, and I never knew him well, but I did know him to say hello at the different parties and stuff. And when I had a major airplane accident in 1961, he was one of the very few that took the time to write me a letter, which I have framed in my den, and a 2-page letter, and in between the 2 pages I have a picture of him taking off the carrier to bomb Tokyo. And he told me that basically we all make mistakes, but the important thing is to profit and to learn by your mistakes. And so anyway, I thought that was, it always helped me recover. I was a long time recovering from this crash. Anyway, in 87, when Bill Moore came out with that Eisenhower briefing, I thought, well, Jimmy Doolittle would have to know. Now, he wasn't listed as an MJ-12 member, but he certainly was there. They sent him to Norway to investigate the weird saucer sightings there. And he had retired and moved to Carmel. His wife had passed away years before, and he lived by himself in a Carmel up by Monterey. And my mom used to stay in touch with him all the time. Now, they would meet together or meet at the different aviation conventions and award ceremonies and so on. So I thought, the key to this is to get my mom to ask him if MJ-12 is real. Now, I thought, boy, this is going to be tough to do, but I'm going to try. So when I was in Reno on one of my visits there, I sat down and talked to her, told her what I was doing, and told her how important it was for me to find out about MJ-12. And I said, I would like you to call him on just one of your regular calls and say, Jimmy, John's getting involved in something, and I don't know whether it's real or not, or good or bad, and I just would like to know if MJ-12 is real. And it took me about 6 months to get her to go ahead and do this. And she finally did it, called me up and said, Well, I asked him, I said, what did he say? He said, yes, it is Moya, but I can't say anything about it. So that was the key, and it's really now, 2017, now being recognized as the key point in UFO research to find out that MJ-12 is real. And
so what was MJ-12 or Majestic 12, and what were the MJ-12 papers?
Well, the MJ-12 papers were the Eisenhower briefing in 1952 when Eisenhower became president, and they had to brief him on the question of the saucers because they were keeping it very secret. Very few people got to know anything about it. And when President Truman got briefed on the saucers in 1947, he formed MJ-12, which was a board of 12 scientific and military personnel to evaluate the question of the saucers. Are they hostile? Are they friendly? And we have to keep it a secret. At the same time, he formed the NSA, National Security Agency, to follow up and also be an investigative unit for UFOs, but they were supposed to hide the NSA as being nothing to do with saucers, which they did a pretty good job of. Anyway, President Truman formed this body of 12 men, and in 1952, when Eisenhower was elected, MJ-12 wrote this briefing for Eisenhower, and in 1987, somebody sent a copy of it, redacted. There was a lot of blackout in it, sent it to Bill Moore, and he passed it around to various people. And that was the origination of MJ-12 and how they fit into the UFO story.
Let's go back to the origin of modern ufology, the Kenneth Arnold story and the crash at Roswell, New Mexico. For those who may not know, who was Kenneth Arnold and what do you think actually happened at Roswell?
He saw saucers, what he described as skipping along as like you throw a plate or something across a body of water. And he was interviewed by the press, and it became a big deal, big story. And of course, the same weekend, or just before, or just after, was the Roswell story. And the Roswell was a crash of one or two UFOs at Roswell, New Mexico. They recovered 4 bodies, and Mac Brazel, who was the rancher on whose ranch the one saucer crashed, and he had that happened on July 3rd or 4th, and he waited during that July 4th weekend until the 6th before he went into town, and then briefed the sheriff, and eventually went back out to the ranch with what was the guy's name, the security guy, and they picked up some more stuff, brought it to Roswell. The Army took over and hushed it immediately up. Before they were able to hush it up, the story got in the newspaper that the Army had recovered a flying saucer, and so they had to really erase that story, and they did it when the shipment of part of the wreckage was sent to Wright-Patterson. They stopped at Carswell, and General Ramey held a press conference and said that it was nothing but a weather balloon. And they had the chief intelligence officer, I don't know how I could forget his name, and standing there, and they had parts of a weather balloon, and they said this is all there was to it. And so that was the essence of the Roswell crash.
Now, if I remember correctly, John, you believe there were 2 crashes in the Roswell area that night. And so what do you think actually happened that caused the crash?
I think there were 2 crashes. I can't remember where the other one was. I think it was south of the one crash. As to what happened, I think it was intentionally crashed by ET. I don't know exactly what caused it to crash, but they decided not to clean it up, which they usually did, and leave it there and let us find out how far technology was in advance to what we had. And part of the wreckage went to Los Alamos. Part of it went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And at Wright-Patterson, there was our Air Force surgeon, originally Army, and then became Air Force surgeon. His name was Randy Lovelace. And he was from Albuquerque, and they sent him back to Albuquerque to build the Lovelace Clinic, which was going to be a very advanced, state-of-the-art hospital, and it was going to be a cover for where the aliens, dead or alive, were sent, and they could be autopsied and held. And in 1947, 48, they built a huge underground facility there in the Monsanto Weapons Storage Area, just to the east of the Kirtland Air Force Base. And that's where, for years, that they kept the alien bodies. Now, they had different access hallways and routes to get into there, and to be sure that nobody got into there that wasn't supposed to be there, they had a series of keypads that you would have to press numbers, and you got 3 tries. And the third one, if it was wrong, the room was immediately filled with a poisonous gas, and you were instantly dead. And they were very serious about keeping it quiet, and that's one of the ways they used it. Now, oddly enough, when I had a crash in a Bucher Youngman, which is a German-produced biplane, near Geneva, Switzerland, on June 24th, 1961, I was in recovery there at a hospital in Geneva. They didn't have all that great facilities, so I was in the hospital for about 6 weeks, then sent home. And we had a ranch. It was called the Ranch, outside of Geneva, in a town called One, O-N-E-X. And I continued my recovery there. And one of the people who was always visiting my dad and was involved in the original design of the Learjet was a guy named Gordon Israel. And he was a aircraft designer and had been instrumental in different aircraft designs. And he walked into the room, and there was an odor in there that he smelled. He went to my dad and said that he was a ex-Marine, had been in the South Pacific. He said, I know what gangrene smells like, and your son is going to lose his leg unless you get him to the United States and get proper care for him. So they put me immediately on a plane. I went to Denver, and I was picked up in Denver by Dr. Lovelace, Randy Lovelace. He had a Twin Beach, and he had a pilot who was the dumbest guy you had ever seen. I mean, it's absolutely amazing that he lived as long as he did. But anyway, he picked me up in Denver. Randy Lovelace was there. I was in the co-pilot seat, and flew me from Denver down to Albuquerque, put me in the hospital, and I was there for about 3 weeks, got totally recovered, all the time having no idea anything about saucers or that Randy Lovelace was involved in this. In 1968, I would believe it was, Randy and his wife were in Aspen, Colorado, and were going to fly back to Albuquerque at night. And this pilot tried to fly VFR through Independence Pass, and they crashed, killed everybody on board. And the interesting thing was that when the first rescue team got there in the morning, many hours after the crash, somebody had already been there. There was footprints around there. The plane had been ransacked. All the luggage had been opened. All the briefcases had been opened. Everything had been turned inside out. And obviously, they wanted to be sure that nobody found anything that Randy Lovelace may have been carrying that would indicate his involvement in the UFO problem. UFO question. But anyway, Randy Lovelace had, I think, 5 or 6 children. 4 were boys. They all died of polio in the middle 50s. His daughter ended up as head of all the stuff that he left, and she was in charge. And as of, I think, 20 years ago, I had a friend that was trying to get more information from her, but she would not say anything or release anything at all. And I haven't heard anything for 20 years, so I don't know whether she's still alive or whatever happened to any of the information that Lovelace had.
Now, there have been a variety of stories regarding Washington, D.C. officials that may or may not have been on site in Roswell shortly after the crash. So, namely, there have been stories that President Truman may or may not have been there. What I want to ask you, John, is do you think Truman was on site after the Roswell crash? And if not, which officials were?
No, I never heard that. I doubt if he was. The most highest-ranking guy was General Twining, and he had his own private B-17, and I think it was Stan Friedman that came up with the logbooks and showed that he had been in and around Roswell and Wright-Patterson at that time. So he was well briefed, and he was right there in the midst of things. But apparently he was not a member of MJ-12 when it was formed.
Now, there was a former head of the CIA who went into UFO research after his retirement from the agency, was there not?
Yes, that was Hillenkotter, and he left the agency, and it was not CIA, but it was the one just before that. I'm trying to remember what the name of that.
I believe it was the OSS.
Yeah, OSS. I think it was. Anyway, he was very high up there, and he went in to do his own private research and became head of one of the UFO get-togethers or UFO membership things. And it wasn't MUFON, but it was another one, I think. The Mutual UFO Network, I think, was formed later. But Hillenkotter was definitely involved in the research of UFOs.
Now, I've heard there were UFOs over Washington, D.C. in 1952. What evidence do we have of that, John?
In 1952, they flew over the Capitol at night. It was recorded on radar and visually. And not only over Washington, but specifically over the White House. And there's a lot of newspaper articles to that effect.
God, that's amazing. Now, some say that at least part of the motive of the murder of JFK was that he was going to move towards disclosure on UFOs. Do you believe that's true?
No.
So, if not, what do you think happened to JFK in Dallas?
What happened in Dallas is outlined and written in the most thorough research book I have ever read. It's called Final Judgment. It was written by Michael Collin Piper. I've read it several times. It covers every single facet of the JFK assassination, and it covers everybody that anybody has suspected of being involved in the assassination. But his theory, and he outlines it very well, very clear, and very positive, and I believe totally what he found out. And what he found out was that JFK was insistent that Israel show their research and atomic weapons at Dimona in southwest or southeast Israel. And they allow inspection by the International Authority of Nuclear Weapons, and they refused to do it, absolutely refused to admit anything, that they had any weapons, that there was any research facility, and JFK kept pressing it to the point in the summer of 1963, Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, went to Mossad and issued the order to kill Kennedy. There was just no other choice. As far as he was concerned, they didn't want to expose or admit that they had nuclear weapons, and the only way to do it was to kill Kennedy. So after he gave this order, he resigned as prime minister, and it took 5 months for Mossad to pull everything together. The main, people say the CIA was involved. They were involved only to the extent that James Jesus Angleton, who was head of CIA, American CIA station in Rome at the time, 1947, that Israel became a nation, and he was sent by the CIA, head of CIA, to Israel to help MI6 form Israel's own intelligence agency. Now, somehow, some way, in 1947, 1948, James Jesus Angleton was compromised. It doesn't say how. It doesn't say who did it or what he was involved in, but he became not member, but he was owed to the Mossad agency. So that when Angleton was transferred back to the United States in 1954, he was assigned as Deputy Director, hold on just a second here, Associate Deputy Director of Operations for Counterintelligence for the Central Intelligence Agency. And his big thing, anything that's written about Angleton, was his search for the mole. And he felt there was a Russian mole in the CIA, and that's all he could talk about. All his research did. Anybody that contacted him, that's all he talked about. And in fact, he was the mole. And he would pass information to Israel, who passed it on to Russia. This was finally found out in 1972 by Bill Colby, head of the CIA, and Colby was the one that fired him. There's only one monument of any American in Israel, and it's that of James Jesus Angleton. So he was the one, and it was all over the exposition, the attempt to find out how many nuclear weapons Israel had. It had nothing to do with the mafia. It had nothing to do with anything that you hear about. And just recently, on one of, I think it was Facebook, they had a story of a CIA agent that was dying, and he said he was personally responsible for destroying building number 7 with conventional weapons. And of course that was total BS, but that's the type of stuff that the CIA does. You know, when somebody's ready to die, that was a CIA agent, they feed a story that allegedly he was involved in, and they pick something that's current, and they say, yeah, he was the guy, and then they have an interview, and he said, yeah, I was the guy, and they try to dispose of the story like that.
Now, I did read once that JFK had an interest in the UFO phenomena. Was that true?
Yes, and I forget what it is, but he had a casual interest, but not to the effect that it involved any of his decisions. The main things they had against JFK was his attempt to, or pulling the weapons out of Turkey, and to put us back on the gold standard, and a few other things.
Now let's move into the 1970s. We all know Richard Nixon from the Watergate scandal, but it's my understanding that he and actor Jackie Gleason have a bit of an interesting UFO story as well.
Right. They were playing golf in Florida, in Miami. Jackie Gleason was tremendously interested in UFOs. He had the largest UFO book collection of anyone. His house was built like a shape of a flying saucer, and that's one of the things he talked about, and his major interest. Anyway, when they're playing golf, Gleason apparently mentioned this to Nixon, and Nixon said, well, let me show you something. And they took him to the Air Force Base there at Florida, I'm trying to remember the name of it, and where they had some of the bodies on, not on ice, but in one of these display units, glass enclosures, and Gleason got to see it, the aliens. And when he went home to New York, his wife noticed that he had totally change in complexion, and he was obviously concerned about something, and she pressed him to it, and he finally told the story of going to see the alien bodies. And she was in the process of writing a book, which she never finished, and that story is just the story that came out of what she was going to say, but the book was never printed.
Before I ask you the question that everybody seems to want to know, I want to ask you about alternative research in the 1980s. You know, it's amazing that anyone born after 1980 has no idea what used to be involved in obtaining all this alternative information. Being able to go online makes it so easy now, but before 1995 or so, you really had to have a desire to get your hands on some research before you actually got it. So, John, tell us about those days. What was it like to have to Xerox papers, to copy tapes, to go to the post office all the time,
right,
and go through what you had to go through to get information in the 1980s?
Well, of course, you know, there was no internet, and the only way you could get any research was to go one-on-one. Nobody would talk over the phone who knew about it. And so in 1987, I was flying for American Transair, and I had to take 4 or 5 months off to get an operation on my foot, which had been damaged in the airplane crash. And so with that 5 months, as soon as I was able to get into a car and get in and out in a wheelchair and crutches, I drove around Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, California, to the different places where I suspected there was somebody who knew about UFOs, would not talk about it on the phone or in the mail, but only on one-on-one. And that took about 2 weeks, and had a very interesting time. I met a lot of interesting people, and that was the beginning of what they called the John Lear hypothesis, which I wrote at the very end of 1987, and that's still floating around.
So because you had to really want to do the work in 1980 to get the research, do you prefer the way it is now, where the research is widely available to everyone, or do you kind of long for those days where you had to be in, you know, you really had to be in?
Yeah, those are the better days, because now it's so filled with disinformation. There's absolutely no way to sort it out, what's true and what's not, unless you were involved from the beginning. And, you know, one of the major stories was the Billy Meyers story. That he was a Swiss farmer who had contact with the alleged Pleiadians. He had a color film of saucers landing on his property. He had stories of being taken in the saucers to different places, and it was really very interesting. And the government, the UFO MJ-12, put billions of dollars into debunking Billy Meyer, to the point where even supposedly good websites, for instance, AboveTopSecret.com, they will absolutely not believe that the Billy Meyers was true. And if you mention it, you're pounded with hundreds of people saying, "Oh no, that was a garbage can lid. Oh no, I could produce that, in 20, in a weekend I could make the same UFO stuff." I mean, it's just unbelievable how incredibly stupid these people are. And I rose to be the top conspiracy guy at Above Top Secret. I think I was number 7 from the top, and it all ended over this Billy Meyers thing, and they just do not want to talk about it or believe it. And I believe that at the time this was going on, they were looking for major financing from someplace, and I believe it was that major financing that made them talk or just try and discredit the Billy Meyers thing. In other words, the money came in and they would say, "But there's only one thing, we want you to discredit the Billy Meyers thing."
So if someone comes up to you and says, "John, I'm interested in UFOs, I'm interested in the paranormal, but there are so many books out there, I just don't know where to start," what book would you point them to first?
Let's see, what book would I suggest to them? If they wanted to know the real story, and they thought that they could handle it, then just read 7 or 8 of the books that Lou Baldwin wrote. And they are the truth. They are absolutely dead on. It may be stuff that you don't want to hear, but he is telling the truth, and Lou Baldwin really has the good story. Now, you can get any of his books from Amazon or Lulu or any of those places. I may read some of the names later in the show. I don't have them right here, but they're excellent books. And I'm trying to think, I thought you might say, which book did you read beginning that influenced you the most? And that would have been, who was the researcher that lived in New York?
You might be referring to Bud Hopkins.
Bud Hopkins. And what was his first book that he wrote?
I think it was called Missing Time.
Right. Missing Time, I think it was the name of the book. And then right on, following that was Communion. And I remember reading Communion. I was flying for American Transair. I was on a 727 flight from Las Vegas to Cleveland. And I remember reading that along the way. And wow, was that scary. And it was scary because it was so true. The way that he wrote it and talked about it. And the odd thing was, over the next 6 months, what was his name? Who wrote Communion?
Communion was written by Whitley Strieber.
Whitley Strieber. Whitley Strieber would call me at 2 o'clock in the morning and bend my ear for at least 3 hours every single evening. And it went on and on and on. He had absolutely no recollection of that. I would call him every week or so to ask a question about what he had said, and he said, "I don't remember calling you." "You say I called you?" I said, "Yeah, we talked for 3 hours." And I never said anything very much during these conversations. It was just him talking on and on and on.
Oh, I can only imagine. Now we come to a very interesting year of your life, the time between 1988 and 1989, which I endearingly call the Year of Lazar. The most asked question I received by email was the request for you to tell the story of your experiences with Bob Lazar. If I recall correctly, the Lazar story actually began with you meeting Gene Huff.
Yeah.
So from here, I'm going to leave the story to you. So how did you meet Gene Huff and Bob Lazar, and how did that story evolve into what it has become today?
I gave a lecture at the Clark County Library there on Spring Mountain. It was the first UFO lecture that had been given in Las Vegas, and it was unbelievable. I had collected all the letters that I had from people like Sarbacher, pictures, all that, and set them up in a display. And I went into the conference room or the auditorium there at the library, Clark County Library, and I went about a half hour early, and when I opened the door, it was jam-packed. And there was a guy there standing at the door. I said, what's going on here? I said, who are all those people? He said, they're waiting for you. And I thought, oh, my God. It was jam-packed, and they were turning people away. And that auditorium held 600 people, and then there was 1,000 people there. And so I gave that lecture, and I think I did another one the next day or the next week, and it really turned the UFO community on its ear, because that's the first thing I had ever heard in that depth and all the evidence. And people would come to my door, and I was rarely home because I was flying with American Transair, and the typical comments were, when my wife had answered the door, one guy would say, he said, your husband is right. He said, I work up in those black areas, and I'm telling you, he knows what he's talking about. And that went on for a couple of years until 1990, when it stopped dead, and what they were doing was trying to find out where the leaks were coming from. And everybody that worked at Groom Lake or Area 51 or the Nevada test site got a lie detector test every 90 days. And the first question, always the first question, was, do you know John Lear, and what is your relationship with John Lear? And still goes on today. Anyway, a couple of weeks after this lecture, my wife was getting absolutely fed up with the people that were coming to the door, the letters that were coming in, the phone calls, and it was just stressing her out to the max. And she took all my research papers, everything, hid them, changed my phone number so that nobody could get a hold of me. And that's where it went on for several months. And during this time, a guy named Gene Huff called me and said, I'm really interested in your stuff. I've always studied this stuff, and I would like to see what it would take to get a copy of the UFO videotapes you have of Billy Meyers and all your research papers. And I said, I'd love to do it, Gene, but my wife has taken everything, and I have no way to access it. He said, if ever you come across, let's make a deal. He said, I'm an appraiser, and I will appraise your house for free if you'll give me a copy of everything that you have. So I went to my wife, told her the offer, and she said, oh, okay, because at that time, as usual, we're desperate for money. And we made a date, and he came over to appraise the house and collect some of the material. And he brought with him a guy named Bob Lazar to hold the measuring tape and measure the rooms. And when Bob came in, he had a folder with him, and in that folder was a copy of his degree with MIT and degree with Caltech. And I put them in my files, and of course, when they became supremely important in proving the Bob Lazar story, they were gone. My house has been gone over many times for pictures and stuff they want, and my phone has been continually tapped when that was the method of recording. And these days they have different ways of doing it. They don't need to tap your phone. But anyway, Gene Huff and I talked for an hour or so, and as we talked about UFOs and the different stories and the stuff we knew, Bob Lazar would roll his eyes and make complete disinterest in what we were talking about, and every once in a while he'd say, you guys are nuts. He said, I worked at Los Alamos. He said, I had the highest clearance there. If there was something like that going on, I would have known about it. I explored all of their classified areas, went into a lot of places that I wasn't supposed to go, and there was no indication of anything like that anywhere in Los Alamos. Over the next 2 or 3 months, we gave Bob enough information that he could take back to his friends at Los Alamos to prove that we had good information coming out of there, and to try and convince him to change his ideas about UFOs. One of the pieces of information was the fact that there was a mail stop in Los Alamos that had something to do with aliens, and the mail stop was titled YY-2. And it turns out when he gave it to his friends and to research, yes, it was a classified mail stop, and yes, it probably had something to do with aliens. Another one was Excalibur, and Excalibur was a weapon that we were developing that would go into the ground 1,000 feet and destroy something that was 1,000 feet below the soil. He found out, yes, that was true, and then there was something else, I forget the third one. But anyway, with those three proving that we did have good contacts, Bob decided to enter the scientific community again. And at this time, he had left the scientific community, and he was developing pictures. He had a picture machine developer, and he would develop pictures for appraisers like Gene Huff, who would take, hundreds of pictures, and they needed him to put in their reports. And he just sat at this photo machine all day long and just would make pictures. And in the meantime, he would get the latest computer technology and fool around with that. And everything that new came out, he would be the first to have it. And at one point, the computer he had in his house was second only in its power to some of the computers at the Nevada test site. So anyway, after the 3 months, Bob called Edwin Teller. Now, he had met Edwin Teller at Los Alamos. Edwin Teller was the father of the H-bomb. They had a conversation out in the garden there at Los Alamos, and it happened that Dr. Teller was giving a lecture, and it just also happened that on that day in the newspaper, Bob was on the front page having developed a jet car. That is a car with a jet engine. And that's how he got to meet Dr. Teller. Anyway, when he decided to find out more about UFOs, he called Dr. Teller at Lawrence Livermore in California, and Dr. Teller, when he got him, he said, got a hold of him. Bob said that he would like to re-enter the scientific community and wondered if Dr. Teller could help him. And Teller said, do you want to work at Livermore with me, or do you want to stay in Nevada? And Bob said, I want to work at Area 51. And Teller said, I'll be in touch. So then the next thing I knew would be December 6th. No, before that, he had 3 interviews, and they called him up, and he would go down to EG&G. EG&G is Edgerton, Germshausen, and Greer, and they were the 3 people instrumental in the development of the atom bomb. And after it was developed, they moved to Nevada and formed the company EG&G, which took over the handling of everything that went on in the test site, including the management of Area 51 or Groom Lake. So he had gone to 3 interviews, and after each interview, he would come back to my den and tell me what the questions were, and each one he said, I aced it. The first one, I remember, I said, how'd the interview go? And he said, I aced it. And so the second one, he said, you're not going to believe what the first question was. And I said, what? He said, do you know John Lear, and what's your relationship with John Lear? And I said, what'd you tell him? He said, I told him that, in my opinion, John stuck his nose into places where it didn't belong. He said, what I didn't tell him is that I also like to stick my nose into places where it doesn't belong.
Right.
And so after the 3rd interview, Bob came over December 6th, would be 1988, sat down at my den, and he always came over in the evening, and we'd talk for hours. And at this point, he said, I saw a disc today. And I said, a disc? Theirs or ours? He said, theirs. I said, oh, my God, you went to Area 51? He said, yep, went to Groom Lake, saw one, touched it. I said, then what are you doing here? I said, why don't you work for them for a while and find out as much as you can, and then come back and tell me? You got to know that they followed you here tonight. And he said, well, I'll tell you why. He said, I've seen you take so much crap over the past 6 months that it's true. Everything you said was true. I touched it. I was in it. You know, and I'm here to tell you it's real. So that was in December of '88, and he worked on and off for a few months, I think, until March 21st of '89. I was over at his house, and he says, "Do you want to see one of the saucers fly?" And I said, "Absolutely. How can we do it?" He said, "Well, they're going to test tomorrow night, March 22nd. Said it's on a Wednesday, and the reason they test on Wednesday is because that day is the lowest flow of traffic on the highway that goes to the northeast of Groom Lake." And so I said, "Okay, great. How do we get there?" He said, "Well, let's take your motorhome, and we'll go up there." I said, "What time is the test?" He said, 9 o'clock. I said, "Okay, well, let's go on up there, and we'll park, set up my telescope, and we'll watch." So it was Gene Huff, me, Bob, and I think Bob's wife. We drove up there, went in that northeast road, got to a place where we thought we could see the best view of. We couldn't see Groom Lake or S4, but we could see where they were behind the mountains. And as we're setting up the telescope, this light comes up from behind the mountains and starts flitting around. And it couldn't have been a plane. It was going too fast back and forth. And I had finally got my Celestron 8 set up. It's very difficult when you have a large telescope, and mine was 8 inches in diameter, to focus or follow a moving object. Very difficult. But anyway, I did get it as it had stopped above the mountains and was settling down behind the mountains. And I got a good 10 to 15 second view of this saucer. And what I saw was flying saucer. It was gold in color. It was radiating a gold substance that was flowing off the side of it and settling behind the mountains. And I said, "Here, Gene, quick, take a look." I was going to let Gene watch it. And as I stepped back, I hooked my foot accidentally around the tripod and moved the telescope. So he didn't get to see. We stayed there for another hour or so waiting for stuff to happen, and nothing happened. The second Wednesday would have been, so it would have been the 29th of March, and that was the night I was on a flight to Cleveland with American Transair, and I called Bob the night before, and I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Oh, not much." I said, "What are you going to do tomorrow night?" Because tomorrow night would have been the second night we were going to go out there. He said, "We're going fishing," which obviously meant they were going to go out to Groom Lake. And I said, "Oh, I'm going to miss it." And so that's the night that he went out with Jim Taliani, who worked at the Tonopah Test Range. And that was the night that during the filming, they heard Jim Taliani talk about what he had seen, and he got fired over that episode. So then the third night would have been March, the 29th, March 5th, or April 5th or 6th. And the motorhome was out of service, so we had to rent a car, and we took me, Bob, Gene Huff, Bob's wife, and her sister. And we loaded up with a Geiger counter and recording equipment and all kinds of stuff. Drove out to Groom Lake, and we got to the point on this road where we had parked before, and I said, come on, let's stop here. There's no point going any closer because we're not going to be able to see any more, in the next mile or so than we are here, and we have time to set everything up. So as we're debating this, we saw two vehicles headed our way, two sets of headlights, and we thought, we better get out of here. So we turned around and went racing down this dirt road, trying to get to the public highway before they caught us. We weren't illegal. We were on BLM land. But we got to a point where we obviously weren't going to make it, so we stopped. I jumped out, started setting up the telescope. Bob jumped out and took his 9mm pistol with him and went out into the desert. He said, find out what they want, and I'll wait 10 or 15 minutes, and then when they leave, I'll come back out. And we said, okay. So he goes out in the desert, and the two cars pull up, and I went up to the cars, and I slammed my hands against the top of the car, and I said, what's going on? What are you guys doing? And he said, well, what are you guys doing? What are you running from? And I said, well, I thought, you guys were involved maybe some kind of dope deal, and I didn't want to get involved in it. He said, well, no, we're not involved in a dope deal. We're security here, and we need to see your driver's license and write down your Social Security numbers. So we were there for about maybe half hour, 45 minutes talking with them. And finally they decided to leave. And they turned around, drove down the road. We thought they were gone, but all they had done was drive down the road several hundred feet, turn around, and were filming us in infrared, and they had a parabolic mic, and they were recording everything we said. And so after about 15 minutes, Bob comes out of the desert. He comes out of the desert and starts talking about his gun and says, boy, I'll tell you, if they'd have come out there, he said, I had the sights of the 9mm right on the one guy's head. I would have blown him to pieces. Of course, this is all bullshit, but they're recording it. So what was interesting, that we saw something green roll across the road, and none of us ever decided to go and find out what it was, but it was a light stick that they had dropped. And anyway, we decided to get in the car and leave, and before we left, the security guy said, we can't kick you out of here because this is BLM land, but if you stay here, we can make it awful uncomfortable for you. So they left, we got in the car. As soon as we got to the highway, the Lincoln County Sheriff was there with red lights and sirens. Pull over, hands up, put your hands against the roof of the car. And so 5 of us got out, and he started yelling all this police stuff about, what are you doing there? And da-da-da-da-da-da-da. See our driver's license. And I made the colossal mistake of my life, which Bob Lazar will never forgive me for. And when the sheriff said, we need to see your driver's license, I said, mine's in the trunk. And, of course, everything was in the trunk, the Geiger counter, the cameras, and all that stuff. He never did go in, but Bob will never forgive me for that. So anyway, about 40, it took about an hour. The sheriff would say, all I have to do is get a warrant. I can pound your car. I can put you guys, da-da-da-da-da, on and on and on. Finally, after about an hour of going back and forth, he says, okay, here's the deal. I don't know why I'm being told this, but I'm being told to let you guys go and to tell you never to come back here again. So he left. We got in the car and drove home. Bob got a call the next morning, either late that evening or the next morning, from Dennis Mariana. And Dennis Mariana was his supervisor at Groom Lake, S4. And they said, Bob, don't go to the airplane today. I'm going to pick you up. Now, Bob's usual day was to drive over to McCarran Field, and this was where EG&G had their headquarters on the south side of the field. And Bob would drive there, park, and the 737s would pull into a little area there where it could turn around and park, and several people would get in. But Dennis said, don't go out there, I'll pick you up. So Dennis came by, picked him up, and drove him up to the Air Force Base, which is now called Creech Air Force Base, and which was then called, I think, Desert Springs or some Air Force station, and on the south side of the Nevada test site. And when they drove in there, that was and still is, where the head of security is for the Nevada test site. And they have repeaters for all their sensors and all their stuff down there. And when they pulled to a stop, a guy comes out, grabs Lazar, pulls him out of the car, puts a gun in his ear, and said, now, Bob, when we gave you this clearance about the saucers, it didn't mean that you were supposed to take all of your friends up there and show it to them. This is a secret. So they gave him this briefing for, it seemed like, hours, and finally they said, now, do you want to work here or not? And he was undecided because what they had found out in monitoring everybody's phone. Mine was tapped, Bob's was tapped, Gene's was tapped. They found out that his wife was having an affair with her flight instructor. And they can't have anybody working at the test site who is a potential for family problems. So they told him, if you get that sorted out, you're welcome to come back. But Bob had already decided not to come back for the simple fact that the last two times he had gone up to this test site, he could remember climbing up the stairs to the 737 to go to Groom Lake, and then walking back down the stairs when he was done working at the end of the day, but he couldn't remember anything that went on in between. And this is an example of how far Area 51 Groom Lake has come with mind control. People don't remember anything they did, and mind control is so advanced, most of it came from Germans who came over after World War II and the studies they had done. And between 1945, when that happened, and 1978, which it was now, or 1987, 88, 89, they had made tremendous strides in the mind control. And it obviously involves something that's placed at the doorway of the airplane that triggers something in your mind that says you'll not remember anything from now until when you come back. On Bob's, one of his first trips to S4, he remembers being taken into a room where there was a doctor, and to go back, the first night he told me about being up at Area 51, I said, now look, they're going to obviously do some mind control, and what I want you to do is, if it looks like they're going to give you an inoculation or something, take off your ring. He wore a ring, and I forget which finger it was on. Take it off and put it on your other hand, and just do it so they're not aware of it. He said, no, they already did it. I said, they already did it? And he said, yeah, they gave me an inoculation, and what they did is on my wrist, they put a kind of a rectangular piece of wire, and it had all these little different compartments, and they took different substances and would put drops in there, and what they were going to see is if he was allergic to anything that might have been there. And then at another point, he remembers being in a chair, and they gave him a pine-smelling liquid to drink. And he drank it, and in about 30 seconds, he felt like he was in a well, like several hundred feet deep, and he felt like he was down in this well, and his fingertips were at the edge of the top of the well, just barely holding on. And they were reading him a briefing, the briefing that he was being briefed with, and one soldier was there with an M16, and every time they would make a specific point about not saying anything about a specific subject, the soldier would take this M16 and jam it into his solar plexus. And he said he remembers that in the room, right close to the chair he was in, the lounge chair he was in, there was a kind of a sheet being held up by two posts, and he said he couldn't see what was behind that sheet, except he knew it was an alien, and the alien was giving him information. When he left the test, after they decided that he wasn't coming back, Dennis Mariana brought him to his home, and Bob came over and told me all what was going on, and apparently they didn't like it because they were waiting on the highway here, Highway 15, and they shot out the right rear tire of his car, and he had to pull over and change the tire. And it was a very, very uncomfortable 2 weeks because he spent some nights at my house because he was scared to go home, and there was just all kinds of stuff going on. One of the things that happened is we obtained, and I'm not going to tell you how we obtained it. Some people say we got it at the test site, and I will say no, categorically that's not true. We obtained some 115. Now, the 115 that the aliens gave the MJ-12, there was 500 pounds of it, and they took it to Los Alamos, and it was machined into triangular shapes. Now, if you go on the internet and explore 115, you'll find out pictures of how this was machined and what shapes it came in. But we ended up with 3 of those triangular shapes, and the triangular shapes were what powered the flying saucer. It weighed 233 grams. It was about 2 inches long. It was a perfect triangle, and or actually elongated triangle. And this would fit into the power, actually the motor, power supply for the flying saucers. And this little thing would fit in the top. You take off a cap, put this thing in the top, and it would last, I think it was a couple hundred years of fuel. And the saucer could go anywhere, anytime. The technology of the saucer is really interesting. They grow it, like you grow grapes on a vine. They grow their saucers, and they have intelligence, more intelligence than humans have. And when the saucer is finished growing, it has no seams, no rivets, no bolts, nothing of that sort. The only thing that's visible is the aliens put their hands out, and some kind of desk or protrusion comes out of the floor, and they do whatever they're supposed to do with it. And that's an interesting part of the saucer. I had a friend that came to my house once, said he was an Air Force photographer stationed in Honolulu. He said he was transferred to Norton Air Force Base in like the middle 80s, like 85 or 86. And he was picked up at Norton with another photographer in a limousine. And the limousine had all of the windows blacked out except the front window that the chauffeur could see out of. And they drove for a couple of hours, and they kind of felt like they were going northeast, which would be to 29 Palms Marine Base. And they got to a specific point and stopped. The car stopped, the engine stopped, and then it was like an elevator. It took them down about, they have no idea how deep it was, but probably, hundreds of feet. So it took him down there, and at the bottom, the doors were opened, and he was invited out. It was a laboratory, a huge underground hangar. There was a saucer being held up by ropes, and he was told, for the next hour, welcome to get out of the car, go into a changing room, kind of a laboratory, where they were given a doctor's smock, and hat and booties, told us to change into those. He was then ushered out of this room, given a camera, and told to go up into this saucer. Now, this saucer was hanging by a net from the roof of this underground hangar, and there was a ladder, and he said he took the camera, and he climbed up the ladder. He said this saucer was about 35 feet in diameter, and he said there was a door that was open, and he took the camera, he put it inside, and then boosted himself to go into this saucer, and when he put his head inside, he said, John, I could have taken a football and thrown it as hard as I could, and it wouldn't have hit the edge. It was huge inside. He said it was at least a couple of football fields, and he said he was so shocked, he backed out onto the ladder to look at the saucer, which was only 30 feet in diameter, but then he puts his head in, and the thing is as big as a couple of football fields. So he goes in. As he's shocked with all this stuff, there's a scientist in there, obviously Canadian from his accent, says, come on, we have pictures to take. And the scientist would put his hand over different parts of the floor, and things would come up like desks and objects. And my friend was tasked to take pictures of all that. Anyway, he was transferred. When we finished all, transferred back to Honolulu, and never heard anything more of that. And that was 86. And oddly enough, he came and visited me here not less than a year ago. I would not have expected he's even still alive, but still alive, kicking, and remembers everything.
How often do you speak to Bob Lazar and Gene Huff now?
Gene talked to him all the time, and Bob, every couple of months. I had occasion to talk to Gene the other day and get his opinion on something. I take pain medication for the wounds I had in the airplane crash, as I get older, they get worse and hurt more. So now, anybody that's taking medication like that, you have to go to a pain company and see a doctor who specializes in that, and he checks you out and authorizes whether you can have pain medication or not. And so I went there 3 weeks ago and gave them a urine sample, and 2 days later they call my wife and tell her that I cannot be a patient there because I tested positive for methamphetamine.
What?
Now, I can't tell you how impossible it is for me to have methamphetamine. I haven't left my den in 8 years. I'm confined to my bed here. The only way I can walk around is with a walker. I rarely see anybody. The only thing I take is my pain medication, and they found methamphetamine, which has really given me a lot of problems because if you test positive for an illegal drug, they can't give you pain medication. And so it's been the last couple of weeks have been really a strain. Anyway, I talked to Gene about it, talked to Bob briefly about it. I asked him I told him the story, and sent him the drug scan. And he said, John, if you'd have had as much methamphetamine as this drug scan says in here, you would have been dancing on the ceiling of the doctor's office. And it didn't make any sense. Who's doing this to me or why? But it's still
well,
going.
John, I mean, obviously you're still sort of in their heads in some kind of way. And for what reason we may not know right now, but that's obviously the case. Now, regarding Bob Lazar, you know, the thing that's always struck me as believable about him is the fact that he has never profited off of his story. And I know for a fact that he had many opportunities to profit off that story. In fact, I want to ask you, do you remember what the largest offer that Bob had was or who it was from?
The offer came from New Line Cinema, and they wrote the script and made the offer, and he turned it down because he said he wanted the truth, and they had put a lot of fantastic stuff that didn't happen, you know, like shooting guns and live action like that. He said, well, that's the only way we're going to sell it. And he said, then you're not going to sell it. He said, because either you print the exact truth or don't talk at all.
I will say this, once again, I find Bob completely believable, completely credible, and it also means a lot to me that George Knapp believes Bob's story because I find George completely credible.
Absolutely, and it's amazing there are people who don't believe it, and what was interesting is there was a convention here, I guess a year ago, and George Knapp told his side of the Bob Lazar story, and the camera, George, at the end of his talk, he says, now I guess there's still people who don't believe it, and the camera pans over to this group of maybe 15 people in the back that were huddled together, and they were the people that did not believe it. No matter what George said, no matter all of, the stuff, they weren't going to believe it.
Now, I just have all the respect in the world for George Knapp. I mean, I just think he's one of the country's last great journalists, and the work he does is just outstanding, and I was actually going to say out of this world.
He's a great guy, and I've told this story many, many times, but I was great friends with Ned Day. Ned Day was the chief writer for Vegas Valley News, and I ran a lot of stories by him, and I gave him a lot of information, and he was just really a good buddy. And he went to Channel 8 and started working with George. And about this time, I'm really heavy into the UFO stuff. And I went to Ned one day, and we're in this office, and I gave him the whole briefing, and it took about an hour. And Ned says, John, it can't be true. And I said, why? He says, because I would have known about it. Now, obviously, somebody from Area 51 got to him, and they said something like, look, there's a lot of stuff that I can tell you about, and I will tell you about because I don't think it should be secret, but I will tell you that the UFO stuff is BS. I think that's what they told him, and I think that he bought it hook, line, and sinker. But anyway, while Ned was telling me this, George Knapp was walking by, and he saw this pile of papers that I had, and Ned walked off, and George came over and said, John, would you mind if I took a look at this? I said, no, help yourself. And that was the beginning of the association with George Knapp. It was because he took the trouble to read that stuff and realized, this might be true. And he put me on his television show, which was called On the Record, which just surfaced on, I think, livingmoon.com or Pegasus on the web. And those original videos with George Knapp on the record are still there. Now, it's very hard to see the videos, but the audio is still okay. And it has George when he's still in his mode of disbelief, but wanting to know more. And it's really great. Yeah, George, it's because of George that any of this is taken off and gotten to the public. it's because he took the time to read it and wasn't influenced by the BS that Area 51 Groom Lake puts out.
So when did Area 51 begin doing UFO back engineering, and what do you think Area 51 is used for today, John?
Area 51 is a square in which Groom Lake is the center. S4, where they have the saucers, is outside of that square on the Papoose Lake. It probably still goes on, but the history of Groom Lake is this. In 1942, the Navy built a runway on the southeast side of Groom Lake for training purposes. In 1945, at the end of the war, they closed that runway. In 1947, the contingent from the Seabees went up to Groom Lake and built huge underground areas. And they built it right where the hangars are today. And it took them 2 or 3 years to build all these huge underground areas. And that's probably where they put the saucers. But they finished in 1950, and nobody knew anything or had anything to do with those hangars until sheer coincidence. Tony LeVere and Fish Salmon are directed by Kelly Johnson to find a place to test the U-2. And by sheer coincidence, they picked the exact same spot where they built the underground areas, underground hangars, as Tony and Fish found for the runway for the U-2. And oddly enough, the people that work at Area 51, they have no knowledge of the underground stuff. When you go to work at Area 51, all you know is what you work on, and you don't ask about anything else, you don't see anything else, you're not told anything about anything else. It's not like when you go to work there, they brief you on everything that's going on there. They don't. So, the people that are there, you can tell whether the stories are real because there's like the elevators that go down into the underground hangars. The SEAL team, Navy SEAL teams are the ones that operate the elevators, and there's no numbers on the buttons, so they don't know how deep they're going. And there's what was that other story I heard about those underground hangars? I forget. I'll remember it in a second. But anyway, it's still going on. The hangars are there. And then in 1995, I had a friend who was flying the F-117A, and he was interested in saucers. He'd come over, talk to me about it. He was very careful not to mention anything that was classified as far as he knew. But what he did tell me in 1995, and this is when nobody knew anything about it, in 1995, the middle of the runway at Groom Lake caved in to the underground hangars because they were just using it too much and the planes were too heavy. And that's when they had to, cover up what they were doing, and that's why they built the second strip. Now, there's a guy, I think his name is Adair, who's got this long line of BS about how he was a protege of Werner von Braun and went up to Area 51 and got in the elevators and saw all that stuff. It's total BS. He says that he went up in 1972, and the reason he knew it was Groom Lake is because there was 2 runways. Well, they didn't build the second runway until 1998. But that's not the only hole in the story. There's plenty of other holes, so I don't know why he's out there and doing it, or whether he's, just what he is out there.
Now, John, do you ever get the sort of longing to sort of drive down that ET highway again, to go by Rachel, to see that land that surrounds Area 51 still? Do you ever go to Rachel and go into the Alien and see Pater Joe Travis? That area seems so tied to you and so tied to Bob Lazar. You would think that you would still sort of long for it. So how often do you go out there?
Kind of. I've driven out there a couple times. I used to go back and forth to Reno to see my folks, and I'd always take the other way around the test site from Tonopah, and drop in and say hello to Pat, and forget who was there. I don't drive down that road anymore because I have been caught 4 times, and I have been advised once more, and that's it. Now, what that's it means, I don't know, but what happened is the people and the guards that were talking out of school and were saying things they shouldn't have, they were putting them in prison in Lovelock, federal prison up there. But the problem was the guys were now telling all the other prisoners in Lovelock about the underground runways and underground hangars and where they were and all about the aliens and stuff. And so they had to build a prison, and it's a huge prison right in the center of the test site. And that's where they put the guys who would have a transgression of some kind, and it's really pretty bad because there is no way out of there. None.
Now, many have also heard of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. What is its history, and what do you think its main purpose is today?
Wright-Patterson was the first main area for all secret airplanes and all secret stuff of the Air Force. And there's a lot of underground stuff there. Nobody talks much about it because it's very well hidden. But they have they have airplanes, they have 747s and C-19s or C-17s, I forget what the new one is, highly modified to be able to pick up saucers that have been downed or crashed or somewhere, and they can just taxi over them or get somebody to tie it to them and then fly to wherever they're going to put them off, whether they're going to put them off at Groom Lake or any other place. Now, one other secret place I know about is 44 miles south of Wendover Air Force Base, on the Utah-Nevada border, is a huge secret runway like Area 51, as big as Area 51, and that's where the black triangles that we have fly out of. Now, what they've developed is a way to hide something on the ground with several transmitters, and they put them on the side up in the mountains, projected down into where they have these facilities they want to hide, and they can put in desert, forest, all kind of whatever they want. And if you're flying over it or driving over it, you can't see anything except what they are projecting. And that's what they have up at this one base. They have it at many other bases, but one of them is in the middle of the test site, Nevada test site. They started 25 years ago building a very secret area called Sandia. Now, that's the name I know it as. Now, there may be another name, but halfway between the Tonopah Test Range and Groom Lake is a huge airport. He has 2 runways oriented northwest, southeast, and in the middle of these 2 runways is a huge hangar that extends about 5,000 feet. And what this enables them to do is fly a secret airplane out of one side of this hangar and use the runway that's on that side of the hangar, and it will be completely unknown to the people working on other secret airplanes on the other side of the hangar and using the other runway. It's really ingenious because they're able to keep secrets airplanes without too many people knowing about it by completely separating them. In addition to this area on the Paiute Mesa, there is an underground facility, and the part that I know about, there's 5 holes a mile deep, several hundred feet in diameter, and in there are living quarters for 15,000 combat armed troops in each of these 5 holes. And in addition to that, are the laboratories and offices and other research areas. And what they did is there's a mountain range in this Paiute Mesa, and they took the top off the mountain, built the secret areas, and then put the mountain back on top so it just looks like it's a regular mountain. And the reason I know that is because I used to fly at the test site. My job with Dynalectron was to fly the research airplanes. One was an OV-10, one was a Turbine Beach, one was a B-26, something else. And these were used to monitor stuff in the air. And what I used to do is, before they did underground nuke tests, I would say if the test was scheduled for 5 o'clock in the morning, I'd get out there at 3 o'clock and fly around the perimeter of the Nevada test site and give them winds and directions from surface to 10,000 feet all around the perimeter. And while I was flying around the perimeter, to the north was this Paiute Mesa and its associated mountain range, and it was totally white, and I couldn't figure it out until I looked carefully, and what I was seeing was they were taking the top of a mountain off. They were cutting it off so that they could build the secret area and then put the mountaintop back on. And so that's what I was seeing, and the area, let's see, the time frame would be 78, 79, 80.
I want to ask you about a very famous conspiratorial work of the 1980s called Behold a Pale Horse. Now, it's my understanding that you knew the author, Bill Cooper, pretty well. God, what an interesting character. So, do you have any stories about Bill Cooper, and what was your impression of Behold a Pale Horse?
Bill and I were great friends, and I met him when the web first came out, and I forget the name of it, but there was only 4 or 5 people on it, and I started talking about all the stuff that I knew about, and then this guy comes on named Bill Cooper, and he says he can vouch for at least 80 or 90% of what John Lear says because he was in the Navy, and he was involved in some of their stuff. So I got a hold of his number, and he drove up to Las Vegas and stayed with me for a couple days. And we got to be great friends. We did a few interviews together, and then on one of the interviews, he started coming out with some outrageous stuff that I knew absolutely to not be true, and we sort of drifted apart then, and he started throwing insults my way, and what happened was, in one of these interviews, remember I told you about the secret Excalibur that we gave the information to Bob on, and well, he said that he saw that in the Navy, and that was, 30 years before that, and we only got around to actually putting that on paper in 1988 or 89. And I said, now, Bill, how can you say that? I know the origination of that. You couldn't possibly have seen it in the Navy. He said, yes, I did. I saw that in the Navy. And there was a couple instances like that, so we drifted apart, and he had a large following. As a matter of fact, his following is so big that Behold a Pale Horse is the most read book in the United States prison system.
Well, John, to be honest with you, I can't say I'm really surprised by that. And and what I mean by that is, if you think about it, those men and women who are locked up have an instinctive distrust of the state. And for those who believe that the state has done them wrong, I can understand the draw of Behold the Pale Horse. I always say that it's not an academic work, but it's the first time I really read a book that sort of throws a hammer through the window of the establishment.
Yeah.
So I do understand that. Now, one of the theories from Behold a Pale Horse is that the driver, William Greer, shot JFK. Now, that was an in vogue theory in the late 80s, early 90s, partially because of Behold a Pale Horse.
I was the one who promoted that. You know, it's interesting because in the last couple of weeks, it started to come back that the driver shot JFK. And I know for sure that it was Mossad. Now, whether Bill Greer was associated with Mossad, I don't know. But what's funny is that story is coming back now in the last couple of weeks.
One of the more interesting UFO stories, which Hollywood dramatized pretty well in the movie Fire in the Sky, is that of Travis Walton. What do you think about the Travis Walton story, John?
During the 4 weeks I told you that I drove around Colorado, New Mexico, and interviewed people, I went and met Travis, spent the day with him, talked at length about his experience. There's no doubt in my mind that happened. Anybody that doesn't believe it hasn't talked to Travis. I mean, it's true. It's exactly what happened.
Now, you made multiple appearances on Coast to Coast AM when it was hosted by Art Bell. Now, those years are really important to me because they're partially, at least, responsible for opening my mind to all these alternative theories that we talk about on the show and on the site. And I was such a fan of that show, John. I was such a fan in the 1990s, and I would love to hear about Art Bell. So what was Art really like, and how often do you speak to him now?
God, I haven't spoken to Art for a long time, even though I've emailed him several times. Art invited me to be on his show, and I think we're talking about 1989. And as far as I believe that somebody sent me those original tapes. I haven't listened to them, but Art, in an interview with Time Magazine, gives me credit for being his mentor and for starting him on the alternative stuff, because prior to meeting me, he was strictly sports, news, stuff like that. And when I started to go on his show, he completely turned around and started the alternative stuff, and his popularity went sky high. And so, yeah, we were good friends, and he'd call me every once in a while to be on the show. He was a great host. He knew how to interview. He knew not to interrupt. He knew all the stuff that a host needs to know, and it was really, really great to work with him. Had a fabulous memory. I could bring up stuff that I'd said way before, and he'd go into, all the stuff that I'd said, and just remembered everything.
Now, one of the pivotal moments of the glory days of Coast to Coast, John, was the night you gave Art Bell a disclosure test. Now, there was much talk in the 90s that the White House was going to soon disclose information about UFOs, as there always is. Now, you believed, at that time at least, that the release of that information might not be such a great thing. Now, you've agreed to read that disclosure test for us tonight. So, John Lear, the floor is yours.
Okay, so Art says, let's say the government chose me. They're going to use me as an outlet to release this information. Let's say they just did, and took me to a briefing. Then what, John? I say they whisk you to Washington, D.C. They get you limoed to this building, beautiful building. You go up to this room. They say, Art, you're the guy, and if you give us the go-ahead, we're going to release everything we know to the public. If you decide on the basis of the information you see, all major networks will be provided with information on all aspects of the cover-up, and no type of information will be withheld. Because of the deal for immunity for all participants of the cover-up provides that nothing, no artifacts, no piece of information will be withheld. So here's what happened, Art. We'll use some videos and stills. Our first UFO recoveries were early in the 30s. We made a couple in the beginning of the 40s, and then came Roswell, which the public found out about. We got 4 aliens, 2 of which were alive, out of the Roswell Crash. 1 died shortly thereafter, and 1 lived until 1956. And we found out so far there are over 100 different alien species that we know about monitoring Earth. Some are good, some are hostile, but most are indifferent. We found out that humans are a product, if you will, of an alien race who we never met, and we don't know who they are. All we know is that the Greys are cybernetic organisms, glorified robots, if you will, who work here at the behest of their employers, monitoring us through abductions. We were never able to find out what humans are all about, except that we have been extremely corrected, externally corrected, about 65 times. And they, the aliens, refer to us as containers. There's been speculation that the souls our bodies contain exist forever after they are born and made. Since 1938, we've lost over 200 aircraft due to UFO hostilities and thousands of soldiers in all kinds of different actions with aliens. Since that time, several 100,000 civilians have disappeared with no trace. Several thousands of those were eliminated by us of their chance encounters with the aliens, which we could ill afford to have publicized. A slightly more frightening phenomenon known as human mutilations have occurred on a regular basis and are similar to cattle mutilations in that the humans are taken from the street, so to speak, and returned to the same area about 45 minutes to an hour later with their rectums cored out, their genitals removed, eyes removed from their sockets, and completely drained of blood. In all cases, it appeared that the mutilation procedures occurred while the persons were alive and still conscious. One of our scientists speculates that apparently the human specimens had to be alive for the samples to be worth anything. Abductions occur on a daily basis throughout the United States and occur to at least 10% of the population. When we were first made aware of this, we protested to the little gray beings we held in captivity at the YY-2 facility in Los Alamos. But a deal was struck that in exchange for advanced technology from the aliens, we would allow them to abduct a very small number of persons, and we would periodically be given a list of those persons abducted. We got something less than the technology that was bargained for and found that the abductions exceeded by 1,000,000-fold than what we had naively agreed to. In 1954, President Eisenhower met with a representative of another alien species at Muroc Test Center, which is now called Edwards Air Force Base. This alien suggested that they could help us get rid of the Greys, but Eisenhower turned down the offer because they offered no technology. At this point, it became apparent to all involved that there were thousands, perhaps millions of gods. Certainly some form of computer record stores information, and on occasion miracles displayed by the aliens to influence a religious event. This so unnerved Eisenhower that he had, "In God We Trust," put on paper money and coins and put in the Pledge of Allegiance to reaffirm the public belief in a God. Shortly after this, it was determined in meetings between the U.S. and Russians that the situation was serious enough that a Cold War should be manufactured as a ruse to divert attention of the public away from UFOs towards some other scary threat like the H-bomb. It was also decided to keep the ruse secret from any elected or appointed official within both the U.S. and Russian governments, as it took so long to vet these officials, and the ruse was easier to manage if the top people didn't know about it. In the late 1950s, NASA was formed, compartmentalized, containerized, and sanitized information from all space platforms and vehicles. We sold NASA to the public, claiming that all information would belong to them, but they got very little, and even that was highly sanitized. Our first efforts were to keep the public from learning about Venus, a very similar planet to Earth, and its population is very similar to us, just technically more advanced. We have learned a lot from them, starting with the Russian Venera 1 and U.S. Mariner 2. We made Venus look like a lead-melting volcanic surface spewing sulfuric acid into a pressurized atmosphere 90 times that of Earth. And as often the case, we overdid it, and we wondered why nobody asked how a parachute survived a descent into 800-degree air. We set up operations in Pine Gap, Australia, to preclude any spying eyes figuring out what we were up to. We regularly eliminated, through extreme prejudice, anybody who was part of the operation and made the least little tiny threat about disclosure or dissatisfaction with any of our operations. Any space mission that include Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, Mariner, Voyager, Clementine, and all the rest, all data initially came transmitted to Pine Gap, and then it was relayed to JPL or wherever after sanitizing. We had a little trouble with amateur radio operators, but we figured out how they could intercept signals, but we managed to deal with that. When the Russian threat began to fade, we introduced Vietnam, which kept the public occupied for 10 years. The cover-up and personnel to run the operation began to get bigger and bigger and required more and more money. We were forced to inflate the defense budget, which soon was not even enough. Then we got into the drug business, which was still not enough. We then were the ones that looted the savings and loan industry and Wall Street to boot. It was so out of control now that most people want immunity and want out. But there is so much secrecy and so much double and triple blinds in place that it's unlikely that this thing can ever be dismantled. And if you give us the go-ahead, Art, to spill the beans, but the public, it's unlikely they will get anything more than, yes, we recovered a flying saucer, and yes, it was occupied, but that's all we're going to tell you. So go ahead and roll the tape for Mr. Bell. What you see here is what human mutilations look like. That one was a male, about 25 years old. That one over there of dead aliens being pulled from the wreckage of a craft that crashed in Atlanta, California in the 50s. That craft you see over there was over 250 feet in diameter and had to be buried on the spot. And that site is in Utah near Garrison. It's still there. The object you're looking at now is the Kecksburg Acorn, which was brought to Wright Pat in the middle of the 60s. There's Frank Drake trying to force information out of the being tied down on that stretcher. He was supposedly from Tau Ceti. These pictures you're looking at now are structures on the moon. That's the tower in Sinus Medai, and it's over 7 miles tall. And that thing over there is what we call the Colossus of Agurum in Mare Crisium. We don't know what it does, but the machine itself is bigger than Brooklyn, New York. And now those videos of the domes covering the craters, as you see, some are very advanced state of decay. These are 5-second slides of the 40 or 50 different alien species that we have been able to photograph. That one is the most gruesome looking. The guards at one facility are carefully indoctrinated over several months, being shown pictures similar to, but not exactly like the alien. Only when he's been acclimatized, so to speak, of the horrible-looking beings are they allowed to stand in security positions. Before these acclimatizations were done, we had 2 guards die of a heart attack as the aliens came down a hallway at Groom Lake unexpectedly. And this last clip is of the Kennedy assassination. You've heard of the second coming theory. Well, this is the second camera that recorded exactly what happened, and they had 4 gunmen. at the bottom line. The bottom line was Kennedy had to go. He insisted on releasing what little information we had told him about, and he was trying to withdraw troops from Vietnam, which we were using as a diversion for the public. After Kennedy, we never told any president anything. Nixon only knew what he was briefed as VP, Vice President, in 1952. And that's how he knew where to take Jackie Gleason to Homestead Air Force Base to see the alien bodies we had in storage there. And that's about it. What say you, Art Bell? Do we brief the public? Yay or nay? And I stuttered.
I remember that Art was stuck. I can remember that Art was like, well, John. Now, see, at that time, though, you believed we should not release it. Now, do you still believe that?
Yeah, there's no way to release it. I mean, it is so, it's so involved, and there's so much. I mean, what would you release? All I tell people, if they want the information, read Lou Baldwin's book, because it's all there, and that's real, and that's nothing. Lou says more than the government could ever possibly tell you.
Now we have a question from an emailer, this one from Charles in Illinois. He says, John, have you ever been visited by any men in black, and did they threaten you to stop talking?
No, I've never had any MIBs at my house. That I can remember, nobody has ever threatened me to stop talking. And that's very weird to me, because I've said a lot of stuff, and I can't understand why they don't kill me. Why? There must be somebody protecting me. Now, I've been told that, and I take that with a grain of salt, but there's got to be a reason why I get away with a lot of the stuff I do.
Yes, John, especially since you're the first question on the Area 51 employment exam, I'd say yes, it's pretty hard to understand. Now, let me get to something very serious here. So, as a pilot and as someone very knowledgeable on aeronautics, I've always been amazed at the flying that was supposedly done by terrorist pilots on 9/11. What happened on that day, John? Like, what happened to those towers, and what were your thoughts on the day, and what are your thoughts now?
There were no planes on 9/11. What the public saw were holograms. Now, we've had holograms for almost 40 years, and we can project anything we want. Flying airplanes, we can project noise, we can project light, we can project anything we want. And my friend Norm Berggren, who has since disappeared, was a scientist at some of the largest companies in Sunnyvale and in Southern California. And I used to go to his home in Los Altos Hills in San Francisco and talk about stuff. He was the one that wrote The Ringmakers of Saturn, in which he found alien craft 30,000 miles long and 2,400 miles in diameter. Anyway, Norm told me he was driving to work one day from Los Altos Hills down the Bayshore Freeway, and 200 feet above him is a 747 type aircraft just floating along at maybe 40, 50 miles an hour. He said it was clear as a bell. He said it was flying slow. He said there was no way it could have been a real airplane. It had to be a holograph, and that was the advance of the technology at least 30 years ago. So what they saw, what the people saw in Manhattan was holograms. It's obvious. You see the airplanes fly into buildings like it was butter. Of the two airplanes there should be 6 million parts in the both airplanes, 3 million apiece, and every part in an airplane is stamped by the authority that made it, whether it's a rivet, whether it's a box, whether it's a chair, whether it's an angle. It has to be stamped with the authority of who made it and what the authorization was from the FAA. And it is a fact that not one of those 6 million parts was ever found in Building 1, 2, or 7. Now, recently they had a guy, I think on Facebook, that said that retired CIA, and he was the guy that blew up Building 7 totally impossible. It could not have been done with conventional explosives. The way that they destroyed Building 1, Building 2, and Building 7 was with with orbiting weapons of mass destruction. You can see these weapons clearly on the YouTube that John Walson has taken. They're obviously there, and they're the ones that destroyed the buildings. And what they use is the technology of dissolution of matter. And what they do is when they fire this weapon, it disassociates the atomic makeup of whatever it's being fired at. For instance, if it's steel, if it's concrete, if it's aluminum, it completely disintegrates into dust 80 microns in diameter. And all that dust is what you saw in those pictures of Manhattan floating down the street. That was all metal, that was all steel, that was all concrete, but it was destroyed in dissociation with this weapon. 80 microns in diameter is what it was reduced to. Now, what happened is Oak City, the Murat building, they used this same weapon, but they only used it at half power. And that's why when they went in after the explosion, they found taped explosives to the columns in the building. In buildings 1 and 2 and 7, they used it at full power. What they didn't know is when they released the trigger, that action would still go on. So that when they started to rebuild over the area of Building 1 and 2, as soon as they'd put up the steel and concrete, it would just disintegrate. And so what they had to do is, in that area, they put reflecting pools, and they told the public it was a reflecting pool in honor of the people who died in those buildings. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with covering up the area where that action, dissociation, was still going on, and the reflecting pools are putting thousands of gallons of water every day in order to cover it up.
Wow. So if it was a hologram, then the passengers on the airplanes have to be somewhere. What happened to them?
They're dead. If there's really people there, they're dead. For instance, MH370. I keep hearing about that story. And what happened is that airplane took off from Kuala Lumpur. It probably flew to Diego Garcia to get refueled, and then flew to Israel. At Israel, now somewhere between Kuala Lumpur and Israel, all the passengers were killed. I don't know how they were killed, but when they got to Israel, they took the airplane and they outfitted it with controls of the ailerons, throttles, and rudders and all that, so that it could be operated by an airplane flying near it. So what they did is they had two fighters controlling MH370 when it took off from Israel, and it flew up to the route that the supposed MH17 was going to fly. MH17 never existed. Every once in a while you'll see, like about 3 weeks ago, a ceremony where the supposed relatives of 17 are, paying respect to the people who are good. It never existed. What happened is the 370 was guided up by the airplanes along the route of 17, and when they got over Ukraine, they waited until they got to the area of Zionist-controlled Ukraine, and these jets shot MH370 down. When it crashed, we have pictures that absolutely proved it was MH370 and not 17, and the doctors that originally inspected the passengers on board the crashed airplane said that they had been dead at least 3 weeks. So what happened to the passengers, I don't know. Now, in Shanksville, what happened? There was no airplane there. They had a jet fly over there and do a couple of loop-de-loops and make people think there was something there, but there wasn't. What the interesting thing is about Shanksville, which nobody knows about, there's a unit on an airplane, all transport category airplanes, that's called ACORS. This ACORS unit sends and transmits to satellites the engine speed, the direction, the location, the temperatures of the different units inside the airplane, and they send it to the developers, owners, or whatever of that particular unit. For instance, if it's Boeing or it's Airbus, they get specific information. If it's Rolls-Royce or GE, they get specific information from the satellite about what that airplane is doing. Nobody knew about that, and so the ACORS is giving that information 4 hours after it allegedly crashed in Shanksville. That's when it was on its way to wherever they were going to fly it to. And, you know, many of us remember the photos, the video in Cleveland when the mayor said, you know, we have this airplane here. It dropped off some people at the NASA facility and then took off. And that was the Shanksville airplane. The ACORS was still working 4 hours after it allegedly crashed. The other airplane, the one over the Pentagon, there was no crash there. They had a flyover, and what the flyover did was fly over the golf course just north of the Arco station. It flew low, about 100 feet, and coincided when it passed the area where the explosion occurred. They set off the explosion, and all that was using conventional explosives, making a hole in the building, and then that airplane flew off, probably landed at Andrews Air Force Base about 10 miles to the east. The lady, what's her name? I can't forget it. She was 40 feet from where that hole was. She was operating a computer. Her 6-month-old son was in his car seat below her desk. When the explosion went off, she got up, grabbed her son. She said there was no smell of gas, no smell of fuel, no airplane, no helicopter, no drone, no nothing except the hole and the smell of explosives. And she walked out of this hole with her son, walked over to the grassy area, and got treated by the teams there that they're there to help people. And she said the Army came by and told her that she saw an airplane, and it went in, and she said, no, I didn't. And she stuck to her story, and it's how many years has it been now? Very brave woman. She stuck to her story. So that's the story of the 4 airplanes.
So you don't believe a plane either crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, or was shot down over Shanksville, Pennsylvania?
Yeah, bullshit. Just pure bullshit.
Oh, hey, one thing I wanted to ask you tonight. You're in Las Vegas. Now, I once heard rumors that there was an underground tunnel of some kind leading from Hawthorne, Nevada, to the Pacific Ocean. Now, Hawthorne is about halfway between Las Vegas and Reno, I believe. Is that true, John?
Absolutely. And what they did is when the Thresher and the not Skipjack, it was the other nuclear submarine that was lost, and those were lost exploring the area under the 15 western states of the United States. And what they do is they sit on a hold on just a second. I can never remember this damn thing. A plate. They sit on a plate that floats on the Pacific Ocean. And those 15 western states just sit there, and the Navy found this out in 1960, and they found an entrance at Monterey Bay, right where Fort Ord is, and they found a canyon, and I have a picture. You can go into Google Earth, go to Monterey, and follow that canyon, and it goes right into the shoreline. And what they do is they take the submarines and they get down in that canyon, and that gets them into the under the plate, which floats on the Pacific Ocean, and they can go anywhere in those 15 states. Now, the reason they go to Hawthorne is because Hawthorne, in the mountains there, is a secret area where they manufacture the munitions that go on submarines, specific missiles and specific things that they need on the submarines. And what they do is there's two huge elevators, and what they do is they put the stuff in these elevators and send it down 3,400 feet, because Hawthorne is 3,400 feet above sea level, and it goes down to the Pacific Ocean, and there's huge submarine pens there under 3,400 feet down, where the submarines are waiting for to be given the stuff that they need. Now, this helps the Navy because they don't have to send it by truck up to San Francisco, Alameda, and they don't have to send it to San Diego, exposing all that to the freeways and traffic and stuff like that. They just load it in the elevator and send it down, and they go anywhere they want in these 15 western states. Now, they can go to China Lake. They can go to Groom Lake. They can go to any number of places in these around these 15 western states with their submarine. Another place to go with their submarine is St. Louis. The reason they can go there is there's an area where they work on a specific item on the submarines, which I don't know what it is, but they had to get the submarine there. So the submarines enter the Mississippi down there in New Orleans, and they come up as far as St. Louis. And I had a friend explain to me, say one day, "Oh, is that what they're doing?" I said, "Why?" He says, "There's dredging machines out in the middle of the Mississippi at St. Louis." He says, "I can't understand why, because the barges don't go down very deep, and there's no deep water boats that go there. Why would they be dredging that area?" They're dredging it so the submarines can go up there and not expose themselves.
Well, it just so happens, John, that I'm about an hour and a half east of St. Louis right now, so
really,
we'll see what I can find out about that, and I'll get in contact with you.
Great. Well, you let me know what you found out.
Oh, I absolutely will, John. So let's turn to the moon, one of your specialties. And I especially want to talk about its dark side, or supposed dark side. But first I want to know, do you believe we went to the moon? And do you believe Neil Armstrong actually walked on the moon?
Absolutely not. Impossible. There's about 450,000 reasons why, but I'll just give you a couple of reasons. We have the Van Allen belt, which extends from, I think it's 500 miles out to 8,000 miles. The aliens put that Van Allen belt there, that radioactive belt, specifically so that we couldn't go anywhere unless they approved it, authorized it, and helped us themselves. There's no possibility we went to the moon because of the Van Allen belt, but I just finished reading a book here called Murder on Pad 34, and it's some of the history of Pad 34 and how Grissom, Chaffee, and White and another person were absolutely murdered by NASA. The reason they were murdered is Grissom couldn't shut up about how the Apollo was. His favorite saying was, "This thing ain't going to the moon in 2 years. This thing ain't going to the moon in 10 years. And he was very knowledgeable technologically, and he knew that thing, the way they were building it, it was never going to fly. But they couldn't shut him up, so they had to kill him. And what happened was Joe Shea, who was head of the Apollo program, was the guy that he was usually in the cockpit with Grissom, White, and Chaffee, and he would help them sort out the problems that they were having. Now, people say, oh, they couldn't fit a fourth person in the cockpit. Sure they could. The guy would sit with his lay on his back on the instrument panel in front of the astronauts, and his legs would go into the holding area where they were going to put the alleged moon rocks. Incidentally, the Netherlands, Amsterdam, Netherlands, gave back us our moon rock, and they said, this is petrified wood. Don't give us petrified wood, they sell us as moon rocks. Anyway, so one of the things is all the pictures of the astronauts on the moon are in the daytime, and anybody who knows anything about the moon knows that it's not black. It's a saffron yellow. And before Howard Menger went to the moon in 1956 as a guest of the people that lived there. Now, there's a quarter of a billion people that live on the moon. They're humans just like us, but they're far more advanced. They have all kinds of stuff going on in the moon. In our solar system, there's not 9 planets, there's 40 planets. And of those 40 planets, they all have moons and satellites and all kinds of stuff. There's so much trade going on between the 40 planets with each other. It's so busy that it's very hard to cover up, but in fact, it goes on all the time. So the color of the moon, Howard Menger spent 2 weeks there, and he just died 2 years ago. Fortunately, before he passed away, I sent him email with the samples of saffron yellow. I gave him 6 saffron yellow samples, all just a little bit different, and had him mark an X of the one that the sky looked like. And so then I took that color of the sky and I changed all my moon pictures, the ones that you see on thelivingmoon.com, into that saffron yellow, so that if you look at the website and find the color of the moon, that's the daytime sky. It's not black like NASA says.
Now, I just saw another story where the writer said that the Space Shuttle Challenger explosion was even faked, and it was a hoax, and that the astronauts are still alive, but alive under other names. Have you read this?
Yep. I just heard the story. I don't know. That was a very good story that we both read. It had pictures of what they look like now. That was pretty interesting, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was a fascinating story. Now, I'm not sure if I buy it yet, but the pictures, the photographs were amazing.
Yep.
And so I at least have to stop and think about it, because so much of our history is just wrong and it's a lie. So, John, what's happening on the dark side of the moon?
Okay, now there is no dark side of the moon. There's a far side, and each part of the moon gets as much light as the other part. There's just as much cities and buildings and bridges and arches on the near side as there is on the far side. My wall is lined with pictures of where the buildings are. Now, what NASA did is they took a long time taking photos taken by Lunar Orbiter. Lunar Orbiter was sent by NASA to the moon. There was 5 Lunar Orbiter 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and they were flying around taking really high quality pictures of the moon, specifically to find places where NASA could land the Apollo missions. And of course, there was just a few people who knew that the Apollo missions were going to be faked. Stanley Kubrick was one of them. He's the one that made the year 2001, and he's the one that NASA chose to make the fake moon pictures, moon landing pictures. And he did a really good job. He did it in England, and after he was done, he hid out in his home. He never went out because he knew that NASA killed anybody that had anything to do with the fake moon landing, because they wanted to keep it a secret forever and ever. Why? Because they needed the money. They spent $50 billion on the moon landing, which they used for another project, and the other project was the weapons of mass destruction that they've orbited around the Earth. And like I say, just go to YouTube, John Walson, W-A-L-S-O-N, and he has some fabulous pictures. He just spent a couple of days at my house. He came over from England with some friends of his, and he gave me, I have a Celestron 8 telescope that's been broken for 10 years. He had a friend with him that fixed it in 10 minutes. And he also gave me a high-powered telescope that I've yet to use because it's been cloudy here in Las Vegas. And he's got some fantastic pictures of these weapons of mass destruction that they used on buildings 1, 2, and 7.
No dark side of the moon, John. I can say this, Roger Waters will be very unhappy. Hey, John Lear, thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure. Call me anytime.
America and the world, this has been John Lear. John, you're welcome back anytime.
Okay, great. I just want to tell you one thing, is that people wonder what we're doing on Earth. The reason we're on Earth is because during our last lifetime, and all of us have lived hundreds of lifetimes, we screwed up somehow, and we're down here on Earth to rectify those mistakes. The way we rectify those mistakes is to live our lives with integrity, without envy, hate, or greed, and to express our love to our family members each and every day. That's all you have to do. You don't have to make money. You don't have to be successful. You don't have to do anything else except live your life with integrity.
He's one of a kind. That's John Lear. I'm St. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show. We'll be right back with some final thoughts. I want to thank John Lear for being on the show tonight. You can see why he's always been a compelling figure within the research community, in that he has views and opinions on a wide variety of subjects. We'll try to get John on again in the future, as believe me, there were many issues and topics we didn't discuss tonight. Now, some of you may smirk and roll your eyes at topics like UFOs, underground bases, and of course John's most famous theories, what he really believes is happening on the moon. Some of you may even have doubts about the Bob Lazar story. I can say this about Lazar. He has never written an autobiography, he's never traveled the country making lucrative speeches on his experiences, and he's never okayed a Hollywood dramatization of his life and work. If you had the opportunity and the potential payoff that Bob Lazar could have wrangled from the publishing and Hollywood elite, how many of you would have said no? Bob has never profited from his experiences, and if this were you, what would you have honestly done? Bob Lazar, like him or not, could have made a career of marketing his own story and chose not to. It's easy to say, well, he didn't do it because he would have been exposed under intense scrutiny, or he didn't do it because his life would have been in danger. But Bob Lazar has been under intense scrutiny from the UFO field since 1989, and his life was never more in danger than it was directly after he left Area 51. I hope you realize that the only reason you know Area 51 is because of Bob Lazar, John Lear, Gene Huff, and Las Vegas journalist George Knapp. They are the ones who experienced and then broke the story. It's because of them that Area 51 is now a commonly recognized name even within the conspiratorial world. And does John Lear really seem outlandish? Many of us believe almost everything in our high school textbooks, from history to science, is fabricated, exaggerated, or misconstrued. What do we know now about projects like MKUltra, mind control, the CIA drug trade, and much more? Would it really surprise you to find out in 50 years that John Lear was correct? That John Lear was a trailblazer? That John Lear was valuable? Scoffing is exactly what the national security establishment and the military-industrial complex hope that you do. So now, the choice is yours. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with St. Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to St. Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at midnightridernews@gmail.com, and be sure to visit MidnightRiderNews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening, have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate.